Good morning, everybody, and thank you, Trevor, for that introduction. Before anyone actually thinks this isn't a Cornish accent, it comes from a little bit further south than that. Thank you to Nuffield for obviously putting your faith in me, and to my sponsors, the Dartington Cattle Breeders Trust, for your generous support. Now, before I tell you about my study, I want you to stop and think for a minute. What do you think the dairy sector is going to look like in the next 5 to 10 years? Fewer herds, larger herds, more environmental regulation, more pressures on social licence. And where do you see the dairy beef calf in this? A risk, an opportunity, or quietly becoming the backbone of the British beef industry? 3 years ago, we left the family farm and we moved to Cornwall to take on a tenancy, where we worked directly with block calving herds, rearing calves, and as Trevor said, selling them to local farmers and finishing them ourselves. Our aim is simple: to have a sort of efficient, low-cost to production system that produces forage and beef in a sustainable and efficient way. But since we started working with these farmers, we noticed that a pattern had started to appear. It was clear there was a bias against smaller stature or maybe more Kiwi cross cows. Think about those brown-tinged Angus. And some integrated schemes had gone out and actively said that they only preferred to get calves from larger stature herds. Now, before Keith comes at me saying that I have got a bias against Holsteins, his calves fit a lovely integrated scheme, so therefore they have a home. But on our system, we found that these calves could grow well with the right grazing genetics and the right bull. They were able to produce an animal that finished well and actually made us a profit, which isn't a dirty word, which we sometimes think in farming. So this just wasn't our issue we were finding on farm, it was a national issue. And that's what pushed me to apply for my Nuffield, to understand why some calves fit the system and some calves didn't fit our beef system. Since the ban on calf euthanasia in 2021, things have really changed. 44% of our beef now comes from the dairy herd, and 84% of dairy farmers used sex semen. We've solved the issue of obviously euthanasia and bull calves, but have we actually just created another challenge with smaller stature calves? The UK beef sector is also at a crossroads. The national suckler herd has been decreasing by about 11% over the last 5 years, and prime cattle numbers are getting tighter. When I applied for my Nuffield scholarship in July 2023, the beef price was around just under £5 a kilo, and calves were still struggling to find homes at seasonal periods of the year. Fast forward to spring 2025. Beef price hit £7.50 a kilo, prices we have never seen in our lifetime. And suddenly every calf had a value. It didn't matter what breed it was or what colour it was. If it had 4 legs and it could walk, it was wanted. But my study was setting out to see if we could find a system that was not reliant on high market prices and could put welfare first, because at the moment, the beef sector is relying on the dairy sector more than ever. On my travels, I was lucky to go to some incredible countries, and I chose sort of seasonal block calving herds that had a very similar climate to what we do here in the UK. But I also really wanted to visit some of the beef powerhouses around the world to see how they were also producing beef. And this isn't a UK-only question. This slide was presented to me at the Beef and Lamb Conference earlier this year, and it was posed as a wicked problem. With 1.8 million bobby calves, it's not just an economic challenge, it's a social licence risk. Everywhere I went, I saw that it was either policy or it was market forces that was driving the direction the dairy beef sector was going. And it was policy such as Fonterra's euthanasia ban on calves that was driving their collaboration between the beef and the dairy herds. But in America, where 88% of beef is domestically consumed, very, very similar to here in the UK, it was market forces, as their beef herd was also the lowest that it has been since 1960, and that was driving decisions for dairy farms and their breeding choices. It didn't matter if you led with a carrot or a stick approach. It was actually if farmers understood the why and got the what's in it for them and had the support to make changes on farm. Now, how many times did your mother say to you, eat your vegetables if you want to grow up strong? Well, the same thing applies with calves. Nutrition is the single most biggest driver of welfare and sort of performance and lifetime efficiency through the animal's period of growing. Across pretty much all of my travel, I actually encountered a huge bias against heifer calves. They got the best colostrum, they got the best rearing, and they got the best milk. And this often showed in many dairy beef systems where potentially there was actually poorer welfare and higher antibiotic usage and poorer performance. Many calves here in the UK also move before 42 days, and this is down to TB testing. I'm not going to talk about TB today. It's in my report if you want to read more, but it is probably one of the single biggest challenges we have here within our dairy beef sector. Animals at this period are really, really vulnerable, and obviously if they do not get the right start, we are just stacking the odds against them. I spent a lot of time in sort of Belgium with a vet called Randy Boom. He works with, obviously, veal clients across Belgium and the Netherlands. And what Randy does is he visits these farms weekly and he likes to track health events, but his ultimate aim of what he's doing now is working directly with the abattoir so they can actually track how that animal was when it was younger and obviously how that carcass is performing, because they want to be able to see if there is a link between the two, health and carcass performance. What happens in the first 6 weeks of a calf's life sets the ceiling for the next 18 months. We've reared more calves than ever since the policy change in 2021, but have our skills and our systems actually improved? New Zealand has always been the model for grass-based efficiency in dairy farming, but even they are looking at having to adapt. Rebecca Hickson's work with the dairy beef progeny testing has actually found that by moving from a 50-50 Kiwi sort of Friesian and Jersey mix to 100% Jersey Friesian can actually give 9 kilograms of extra carcass weight, which doesn't sound a lot, but when you add that up over thousands and thousands of calves, that's a massive efficiency gain. And that's why when I met with Pamu Farms, who have 45 dairy farms, they are looking at changing their breeding policy. They have a zero bobby calf policy by 2030, so they're actually changing their breeding to a quarter Jersey and 3/4 Friesian, because ultimately they need to balance milk production, as they are a dairy farming business, fertility, but they also need to ensure that they have a more usable beef carcass within that supply chain. But the cow is only half the story. The bull also matters. So I visited Leachman Cattle Company in Colorado, where they're doing a lot of work producing stabilizer bulls that can work for the dairy herds. When I visited, I obviously got to see some of the crosses that they were doing with Jerseys. I think you'll believe they look a little bit more like hippos than Jerseys, I think, in that picture over there. But they were able to produce really great carcass qualities on those calves, and actually this beef is grading at 70% prime. So although the carcass was slightly smaller, the eating quality of that beef was more, so the processors earned more money. And as their breeding advisor said, a Holstein cow needs a very different sire than a Jersey calf. And our own data here in the UK backs that up. Out of 3.2 million national beef evaluation data sets, we can see that around 10% of smaller stature dams beef calves aren't actually making the 260 kilogram weight grade. Is it just about us actually matching the bull better with the cow? Because a rising tide lifts all boats. The most resilient dairy beef systems they saw weren't ones that focused on scale. It was actually the ones that were able to match their resources, such as labour and what they had. I visited John Sherlock. He was a farmer in the North Island, and having been in a pretty dark place 18 months ago and having to sell his second farm, he decided he needed to make this farm work smarter, not harder. He had kind of downsized his sheep numbers and some of his cattle numbers and actually brought in dairy beef bulls, and he was using halter, collars and virtual fencing technology. John was actually able to, through a trial last year, work out that his own farm was then able to produce 380 kilograms of carcass weight a hectare, which if you look at this graph, you can see puts him on par with the lowland beef finishing system. And looking at that land, I think you'll agree with me, that's not boys' ground. John was able to then obviously plant the steeper areas of his farm into trees for carbon trading, and this was ultimately going to give him a 50% sort of uplift in his farm equity over the next 10 years. The right animal in the right system will always outperform the wrong animal in the wrong place. And our grass-based dairy herds have already proved efficiency comes from system design, not animal size. So how can we apply this to our future beef systems? And just before anyone ever complains about droughts, this was in the middle of a drought, sort of in March this year, and that's what John's farm normally looks like when he has had a bit of rain. We wouldn't buy a car without obviously looking at whether or not it had an MOT or how many miles per gallon it does. So why do we do this with our calves and our livestock as well? Dare I say, is this where livestock information service that has been long talked about is needed, so we have greater transparency from calf on the dairy farm through to the finisher. Uruguay shows the same power of this at a national scale. Every animal is obviously tagged and can be traced from birth, and you can even be able to scan a QR code on a plate with a stake and trace that back to the farm. This gives incredible transparency and market access to over 40 countries that they were exporting to. The average beef carcass is around 343 kilograms now, and it has been decreasing over the last few years, but this isn't down to the fact that we're getting less efficient, it's down to the fact that actually more and more of our beef is coming out of the dairy herd. This is fine if the market actually rewards for quality rather than yield, and I think meat processors are going to have to look at different ways of capturing value out of a carcass if our carcass weights are still going to be declining. We can't compete on a global scale with commodity beef, but I think we potentially could on quality. And Irish data shows this. Looking at some of the breeding evaluations here, you will see that Hereford, Angus and British Blues have some of the highest eating quality traits, and these are three of probably the most well-used sires that we already have within the dairy beef industry. And we can't forget the consumer, because the consumer drives everything. In the UK, the average beef consumer is around 55, and actually chicken dominates younger shoppers' baskets. But at the end of the day, I don't think that the consumer wants to know whether or not it's a suckler bred animal or a dairy beef animal. They just want a consistent steak every time that tastes good and also is very affordable as well. With 80% of our beef being sold through supermarkets, we need to ensure that we've got better grading, better consistency and better labelling of products, because we need to retain those customers. If we lose them, we're not going to get them back. Other countries are already capturing value from other markets. When I went to Brazil and Australia, the nutraceutical market is huge, and it's worth $420 million a year. They were looking then at ways that they could use collagen as a way to add value, because obviously that's worth about £11 million a year as well. And what really stood out in each country was collaboration and progress working together. And one of the best examples I saw was the Dairy Beef 500 program in Ireland. This was working with farmers directly with a knowledge exchange program, and it had really simple, clear messages around genetics, grass, and how to manage your calves. It was real farmers and real examples, and farmers learn best from peer-to-peer knowledge and not being told what to do. Resilience. When beef prices rise, every calf has a value. When they fall, suddenly some calves don't fit the system anymore. But resilience isn't just about margins, it's also about skill sets as well. Rearers were the weakest link in most of the countries that I went to, but they are also obviously the most important one. They are price takers, not the price makers, so we have to ensure that we're able to support them too. We can only cost control what we have within our own business. So where do we go from here? It comes down to the 3 C's: collaboration, consistencies, and costings. We can't farm in silos anymore. We need greater collaboration between the beef and the dairy sectors and consistency. A consistent calf will always become a consistent carcass and a consistent eating experience for a consumer from farm to fork. Costings. The right calf in the right system can be profitable. Context and management is key. And underpinning all of this is the people. It's the people willing to change and have the mindset of, we've not always done it this way, and looking at ways to change. So, for recommendations, if we're serious about a dairy beef sector, we need to kind of focus on 4 key areas. We need to breed with purpose. Every breeding decision on a dairy farm, whether or not milk is your primary purpose, you are also going to have to think about the beef sector, because we depend on you now to have efficient calves. Give calves the right start. What you do in the first 6 weeks of life will set them up for the rest of their period as an animal for the next 18 to 24 months. Build data into a feedback chain. We need greater transparency and being able to share information from farm of birth through to carcass. This isn't to take more control away, it's to get farmers to have better information and make better decisions about what they're doing. And we need to strengthen farmer-to-farmer collaboration and more knowledge exchange. Build long-term relationships between dairies and rearers and keep more of that value within the farm gate. Welfare, environment and consistent eating quality are going to help protect the British beef industry, but also the dairy sector's social alliance. Not all calves are equal, but every calf has a value. And it's our job as an industry to ensure that that value is realised. After Nuffield and my study tour, during my Nuffield, I was actually lucky enough to be part of the steering group for the GB calf strategy, which is focusing on rearing every calf with care. On our own farm, we've also brokered more relationships with local dairy farmers as we realise that TB is one of the biggest risks, and we want to try and mitigate that within our own business. And as you can see here, I've taken a leaf out of Aoifeann's book, and I'm trying to encourage the next entrepreneur in calf rearing. And as you can see, this one definitely gets 50% of his genetics from his dam, because he only has shoes on 50% of the time as well. And all of this wouldn't be possible without these incredible people that open their farm gates. And the person that probably needs the biggest thanks isn't in the room today, and that is my husband up there in the corner. They used to always say that behind every great man stood a great woman. In my case, it's definitely the other way around, and I could not have completed the last 2 years of the scholarship without his support running the farm and running the children. Thank you.